This is the Rate of Rise series brought to you by Roast Magazine and Keys to the Shop. Today we're talking about the NORM-ROAST protocol with Dave Baxter. Well, hey everyone, and welcome to another episode in the series called Rate of Rise, Elevated Conversations on Roasting, brought to you by Roast Magazine, one of the longest running and most respected trade journals in the coffee industry. If you want to keep up with the latest research, knowledge, and insights from scientists, subject matter experts, and roasting professionals from across the global industry, then you have to subscribe to Roast Magazine. Right now, you can get 5% off your subscription to Roast Magazine by using the code ROR. When you subscribe, that's ROR as in Rate of Rise. Roast Magazine offers a myriad of different ways that you can be enriched and equipped to run a great roastery and roast great coffee. Go visit them again over at roastmagazine.com. And don't forget to check out their audio articles over at roastmagazine.com/audio articles, where you can listen to some of the best articles from past issues of Roast Magazine. Okay, everybody. Well, today we are going to be talking about the NORM-ROAST protocol with Dave Baxter. Dave Baxter has avidly roasted coffee for more than 15 years. He applies an analytical approach to master the rather enigmatic art of coffee roasting. Dave joined the Artisan team in 2015 and is a founding member of the NORM-ROAST Consortium. Many of the analytical tools and other features that you might use in Artisan were created by him. Dave is also an inventive engineer with over 60 granted patents. And in today's conversation, we're going to be talking about the NORM-ROAST protocol, which is a protocol to compare energy efficiency in roasting machines. The main idea here is to provide an objective measure by which you can accurately assess the energy efficiency of your roasting equipment and not really just rely on marketing copy from the manufacturer. It's very promising, it's pretty involved, and we're going to dig into a lot of different aspects of this project, the problems that it hopes to solve, different elements of the protocol, how you can participate in this developing project, and then also just Dave's perspective on the idea of energy consumption in roasting, what we can do to make a difference with our emissions, with our energy consumption, with the equipment that we currently have. And it's just a really rich conversation with somebody who is deeply involved in helping provide solutions for the industry that we all love. So I'm really excited to present this to you, and I hope that you get a lot out of it. Here now is my conversation about the NORM-ROAST protocol with Dave Baxter. All right, Dave, welcome to Keys to the Shop. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for asking me to join you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a lot to talk about. There's quite a bit of detail involved in NORM-ROAST protocol, and I'm really fascinated with what it's trying to solve in the industry. It's a really big issue, obviously. Give us a rundown of how you about your work in coffee roasting and how this initiative sort of began.
Sure. So I've been roasting for over 15 years now. I guess a little over 7 years ago now, I got involved with Artisan, which is a roast logging software, and quite a bit more than that as well. But I got involved with that effort. It's an open source project, and I had a lot of ideas based on my roasting of things that I wanted to see in Artisan, and got involved as one of the contributors, and have been very involved for the last 7 years or so in many of the features there. That led to, I guess about a year and a half ago or so, digging into some of the issues with estimating what are the greenhouse gas effects of roasting, and could Artisan be helpful in calculating those greenhouse gas emissions based on the information that Artisan was gathering from the roast profile. And it looked like that was very possible to do, and ultimately resulted in a feature in Artisan that will calculate the energy usage as well as the greenhouse gas emission. But along the way, in researching that, it became quite clear that there's very little information available for someone who's interested in purchasing a roasting machine to be able to compare what are the energy usage and greenhouse gas emissions of one machine versus another. There's a lot of marketing information out there, but when it comes to real information to compare one roaster to another, there's just very, very little. And that's what led to the NORM-ROAST.
Okay, so basically you just have to take their word for it and hope that you can optimize your roaster to have a minimal impact in your emissions, but you'd like to know that beforehand and not have it just be sort of a mystery box.
Yeah, that's right. And when I was doing the research, and even still today, there are a lot of bold claims that can be found. One major manufacturer on their website says you'll get up to 80% fuel savings and reduction of greenhouse gases with their roasting machine. And that's quite a bold claim. When you read something like that, clearly that's marketing speak, but it might sway you to think that you are going to get 80% fuel savings over what you're using today. And I think that's quite unlikely. Because that claim doesn't make a comparison to anything. There's no definition of how that was calculated or tested or measured. And that's not the only instance of that. Another that I saw claimed 50% reduction in greenhouse gases. That's pretty bold too. So a person who's looking to purchase a roaster and wants to be responsible from an environmental standpoint really just doesn't have the information that they need. They are at the mercy of the roasting manufacturer and whatever they tell them.
And so in this research, your aim is to create a process by which somebody could know exactly what that machine was capable of doing, but not just the machine that they currently have, but that the information would be able to be accessed by other people as well before they purchase. And talk a little bit about what NORM-ROAST is in terms of protocol and how it can be used by people before they're purchasing a roaster to find the information that they need.
So NORM-ROAST is as you said, a protocol. It's a definition of a particular roast, which includes time and temperature, to provide a structured and a standard way of performing a roast that you can measure the amount of energy that is used, and also allows for measurement of emissions. But here, where we're talking about energy usage, some roasters like to roast very dark, which clearly could use more energy than a light roast. So the NORM-ROAST defines a particular roast that is maybe somewhere in the middle, and it's not so much about roasting style as time and temperature and environmental conditions and the type of beans that are used, but it allows for a comparable roast. Comparable being that you could do the same roast on multiple machines and repeat the measurements and compare them. So when we started the NORM-ROAST definitions, we started with a set of requirements. So what was actually necessary, and comparable was very important, as well as making it universal so that it could be used on all types of roasting machines, whether they be small or large.
Okay, so what were the factors that you needed to control? What are those elements that are normally not accounted for that you decided upon that did make it universal and would yield those kind of trustworthy results?
Great question. From the requirements, we moved to what are problems? What gets in the way, which I think is the heart of your question there. Beans certainly vary, whether it is due to the amount of moisture that's in the bean, their density, the size of the bean. So you have to control for that to some extent. The batch size, drum speed, airflow, even accuracy of temperature measurements. As a roaster, you find that measurements on one machine for a particular temperature may not be the same on a different machine. So dealing with the differences in those measurements is important. how the machine is preheated, how the exhaust air is treated. Those are all things that can create problems in being able to reproduce a particular roast profile on more than one machine type.
So then, are you giving various categories of types of brewers different standard values? Like air roasters would get, so air roasters would get between this number and this number in terms of airflow or drum speed, and you just have to calibrate your machine according to these things in order to go through this protocol. Or is it more detailed than that, less detailed?
Well, what is provided in the NORM-ROAST is a specification for all of those problem areas. So, or what could be different from one to another. So, in the NORM-ROAST protocol is defined what the things like what the ambient temperature needs to be, because that will have an effect on the roast and how much energy is used. When it comes to the coffee beans, there's a range of moisture levels. You can't have just a single number because there's no way to get an exact, every roast or every bean that you use is 11% moisture, for instance. So there is a range. There's a range for density and screen size, and also for the temperature of the beans themselves. And then there's a roast profile that is part of the NORM-ROAST specification. And as I mentioned earlier, it's based on time and temperature. And so the time in the roast, we look for a first crack to occur at 10 minutes and for the roast to end at 12 and a half minutes with a temperature rise above the first crack temperature of 10 degrees Celsius. And that delta temperature is actually a very important point because the first crack temperature could be defined, but it might be very different on one machine to another. So we look at a delta temperature as being a better way to correct for the measurement differences from one machine to the next.
And that's all stuff that you've come up with from your research in deciding what these values are in these different categories?
Yes, and let me tell you a little bit about the process for how the NORM-ROAST protocol was defined. Along with Marco Luther, who is the guiding light for Artisan and the driving force behind that since the beginning, we assembled a group of roasting machine manufacturers and other experts in coffee roasting to help make the definition, to make sure that the requirements were correct, that we had identified a complete list of problems in making a repeatable and universal roast profile, and that the profile itself made sense and could be used. And so the NORM-ROAST specification, which is available at norm-roast.org, shows all of this information, but it's the output of many people's effort and review. And so it's not just solely from my own research or any other single individuals. It was a collective effort.
It seems like you would then have the opportunity to not only find out information about your own roaster, but publish that information so that other people could look at your information about that type of roaster.
That's correct. And in the long run, I think what would be the most value out of NORM-ROAST is if roasting machine manufacturers would begin to use it as a standardized profile to be able to publish their own energy and greenhouse gas emission data, and thus allow the purchaser of such machines to be able to make real comparisons between them and make informed decisions about which machine they wanted to buy.
Okay, so then that begs the question, I think, if we already have sort of a opaque and not transparent approach to marketing emissions in roasting and, reducing your carbon footprint and all of that, you mentioned as compared to what, if you are to try to convince roasters globally to adopt a single protocol, what's the incentive to kind of do that? Because then one person's going to be on top. Like one roaster really realistically is going to be right at the top, but then others would be just below and it would impact sales. So how do you incentivize people to use something like this objective measure where it outs the inefficiencies and inaccuracies?
That's a great question. And I think I think the way that happens is because people who are buying roasting machines ask for it. As a natural organic process, our roaster manufacturer is going to naturally want to adopt and publish this information. For those who are particularly efficient, probably so, but maybe not the others. And I think it really needs to be pressure from the buying side, which will make it happen. Now, there are some roast machine manufacturers that are looking at and taking measurements based on the NORM-ROAST protocol, and we'll see in time if they go public with that information. But it is happening. But I think that it's really on the purchasing side that will make that happen. The other way that it could happen is through regulation as well, and similar to what's happened in the automotive industry here in the U.S., but also around the world with standardized emissions testing that has forced things to happen. But I don't expect regulation on coffee roasting to happen anytime soon.
And I imagine that you would also have, with that pressure from the bottom, just the incentive to say, okay, well, there's a lot of claims being made by users about our roasters. If we put out the official numbers from the company, that would look better than just having everybody's opinion, because then again, back to the idea of this is what the roasters are saying and claiming about their equipment. And the question in that is sort of like, well, why should we trust them? But then why should we trust, Joe user of this equipment who publishes data about it anymore?
Very true. The one goal of the NORM-ROAST protocol is that it's repeatable, and so whether it's somebody with a roasting machine that wants to make the measurement or a manufacturer, should result in the same level of measurement, the same quality of efficiency measurement. So it is repeatable, and that's a real positive. And if I may, when I mentioned about regulation, with respect to emissions, there today is a lot of regulation on emissions. And here in California, we have the air resources boards that have very tight controls on emissions. But just controlling emissions is not necessarily a good thing environmentally, because that's what's led to afterburners, which oftentimes are much greater consumers of energy than the roast itself. So cleaning the air can be a huge energy user, and therefore contributes more to the greenhouse gases, while its purpose is really to reduce particulate emissions.
Okay, and so with this protocol in place, it would seem like now we're going down sort of like the realm of possibilities here, that having third party verification would be even better. Like not the manufacturer themselves saying we're awesome, and not the users, but just a third party.
It's certainly possible. That's a challenging undertaking, with getting a third party involved to make the measurements, because of the cost involved in doing that and the logistical problems. It also probably begs for having a true standard, and by a true standard I mean one that is maintained by a standards body, as opposed to an open source standard such as this one.
Okay, so what's the difference between true standard and open source standard?
Well, the process by which the standard is created and maintained. A corollary in the U.S. Would be something like Energy Star, which might be a good example for how to do that. The EPA defines those standards for the various products that can achieve the Energy Star labeling, and so in the U.S. that might be a way to go for roasting machines. But roasting is international, and so Energy Star is not, and a true standard would be something that's adopted internationally. It takes quite a bit of work to get international standards in place and adopted.
A little bit more of a theoretical question here, as we're talking about innovation in terms of helping to reduce emissions and make it just healthier for the planet overall, reduce our energy. Innovations in the realm of roasting when it comes to quality control of the coffee produced on the machines, how do you think increasing our ability to control emissions and energy, it plays with the desire to create better roasting equipment for better coffee? Are the two mutually exclusive? Can one suffer as a result of emphasizing the other? How do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of room for innovation that is both positive from a quality standpoint as well as from an energy efficiency standpoint. And the energy efficiency is ultimately what affects the greenhouse gas emissions. There are roasters today that will recirculate exhaust air so that heated air is not lost to the environment and requires that heat to be replaced in the roasting process. So that's one efficiency measure that works pretty well. Preheating of the green beans themselves is done in some very large roasters, not necessarily in the shop roaster category, but that can provide some efficiency as well. And I think there's plenty of room for innovation that will not be detrimental and possibly quite positive to the roast quality that will also improve the efficiency of the roaster.
I guess the thought here is that we would potentially give a lot of approval and glowing reviews for equipment and manufacturers who produce equipment that's innovative around the energy savings, reduction of emissions, et cetera, and that equipment's inaccuracies or inconsistencies would be sort of winked at as a result. So like a hierarchy of need would be, I want a piece of equipment that is innovative for energy. How do we have this standard for emissions and also have a standard for quality to make sure that we're not veering too far into the direction of just giving blanket approval for equipment that's lousy for roasting coffee, but's great on energy savings?
When you say equipment that's lousy for roasting coffee, coffee roasting really comes down to getting the coffee seeds hot. And so there's a large component there that is really dependent upon the roaster, and I'm talking about the person as the roaster, not the machine. It's likely that with just about any, maybe not every, but just about any kind of a roasting machine, that a good roaster can get high quality coffee roasts from it. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think energy efficiency has to at all translate to poor roasting quality. If it's such that you can't heat the beans up fast enough to make a good roast, that could be a problem. But I don't see a fundamental conflict there. And the NORM-ROAST protocol, because of the time and temperature requirements there, will eliminate that underpowered machine that can't reach first crack in 10 minutes or an additional 10 degrees Celsius in the following 2.5 minutes.
A question I have here about the landscape of roasting equipment today that is available. Like a lot of us would look at the roasters that are new roasters that are coming out are pretty small in terms of the most, fuel efficient or the ones that make the boldest claims about energy savings, emissions, etc., versus people who, use the large scale, old, retrofitted equipment that now they feel bad for having maybe in this, marketing blitz for emissions control. A lot of us aren't just going to go out and buy a new roaster. We need to, control what we currently have, and they may not be the most efficient things. I've heard it both ways, that because of the size of the roaster, you have more efficiency because of how your between batch protocol and the amount of coffee you're roasting in the wash actually creates less energy. It takes less energy than having multiple small roasts of coffee that need to be where you're roasting so many times per week versus just 1 or 2 times per week. Is there an ideal here, or is it just vary?
Well, it's a complicated landscape. So there's a number, I guess, of rules of thumb that have circulated about what makes sense and what size of roaster do you need for a certain capacity. But what makes it all challenging is, when we started this activity, we looked at scanned all of the information that we could find on existing roaster models. I looked at something like 700 or so different roasters and got information about their burner capacities and what was published there, tossing out those models where there was either no information or information that was just clearly wrong. It came down to less than half, so maybe 300 or so roasters currently that I have. And what we found is that when you looked at the batch size of the roaster against its burner capacity, there was an enormous spread at any given capacity level, way more than 4 to 1 on the published burner ratings. And so what that means is that even a comparably sized roaster across multiple manufacturers, you're going to have a wide range of available energy if their published burner ratings are correct, a very wide range. And so depending upon which of those machines you're working with might require a different strategy to reduce the overall energy usage. As you mentioned, larger roasters in general, I guess we could say, are more efficient than the smaller roasters, in that if you are looking at the number of kilowatts per kilogram of green coffee that it takes to roast that coffee, a larger roaster probably is a little bit lower. Some of that comes from the amortization of the warm-up period for the roaster. For a drum roaster, it's much less for an air roaster, but for a drum roaster, it takes some time and quite a bit of energy to heat the roaster up. And then the between batch protocol that you mentioned is another overhead that on a larger roaster you have a greater amount of coffee, but you're also probably using more energy to do that between batch protocol. But in general, doing more roasts in a row after having warmed up the roaster is going to save overall, rather than doing lots of roasts during the week, as you mentioned, and heating the roaster up every time. Between batch protocol, shortening that where it's possible without compromising the quality of the subsequent roast is another place where incremental savings can be made.
And this is also something that is dependent on the size of your business and the size, your expertise as a roaster. As you're mentioning, so much of this is also, it's not just the machine, it's how you use the machine. This all makes me think, sometimes it makes me think that it's just better for the environment for people not to start roasting coffee. And, and I'm not saying that if it's perfect for your business, you shouldn't, but with scads of new small roasters, one might consider, wow, well, greater capacity of established roasters roasting a lot of coffee. Just think about the fact that they could be more efficient, and maybe it's an argument for private labeling versus roasting your own. But that's definitely I don't think that's a legitimate option necessarily for the entrepreneurs among us.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, because there does seem to be quite a trend today of shifting from purchasing coffee to roasting it in the cafe or wherever. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? We haven't really looked at it from that perspective. Smaller roasters are not necessarily bad in the aggregate. I suppose that going all to large batch roasting might be better for the environment, but I doubt that. As you say, I doubt that's something that is going to happen. So if those smaller roasters are as energy efficient as possible, that will make a difference.
Yeah, that'll equalize that impact a little bit there. So as we went down the rabbit hole a little bit with theory and thought and all that, I want to get back to NORM-ROAST. And obviously it's a fascinating idea to have a universal standard that sheds a little bit more light on the true value of a roaster's efficiency, and not just marketing. So I imagine a lot of us are very interested in how we could start applying something like this to our roasting equipment, and how to begin that process.
Sure. There's two ways that I'd like to talk about. One, which is applying the NORM-ROAST protocol, which really is making a measurement on the roasting machine itself and not evaluating any given roasting process. And the second way would be to use the energy calculator, which is a part of Artisan, to total up the amount of energy usage for a particular roast profile or roasting process. So in the NORM-ROAST, the output is a measurement of the efficiency of the machine itself, and is useful to understand kind of a baseline. But for someone who already has a roaster installed and a roasting process in place, it may only be useful in comparison to thinking about buying a new roaster. Am I getting a more efficient machine or a less efficient machine, kind of a thing? Because it won't inform on any given process. If, for instance, the roast master likes to roast particularly dark, well, their energy usage will be different than the NORM-ROAST protocol, because it's not a particularly dark roast in the NORM-ROAST protocol. Similarly, if you roast very light, it'll be different from the NORM-ROAST protocol because that profile is different.
But this is in the process of roasting coffee that they would normally roast. But in your protocol, you have a particular origin selected as a ideal. You have all of those variables accounted for. So if somebody was to, I suppose, if their style is outside the protocol, that they would, but they're still interested in doing it, they would just have to use that particular type of coffee and roast it as a cost of actually applying that measure to their roaster.
Yes, that's correct. And the NORM-ROAST protocol doesn't specify the origin, but it does specify moisture and density and bean size. But the profile of the roast is defined, and it's defined in terms of first crack in 10 minutes and roast completion in 12 and a half minutes at a temperature rise of 10 degrees Celsius above the first crack temperature.
Okay, so back to the question is of as compared to what, which is my next question. So you plug in all of these things. You say, I'm going to go through the process. I'm going to fill in the sheet. I'm going to go through the NORM-ROAST process, and I get these values at the end. How do I know I should be happy or not happy?
Great question as well. At this point in time, It's kind of difficult because there are not yet NORM-ROAST protocol results that are widely available. So there isn't a norm against which to compare yet, and in time that will change, and you'll be able to see the differences. At this point in time, you don't have the comparisons to be able to make yet.
When does that change? I don't say like when's it scheduled, but there must be some point at which there's enough feedback and data collected from people that it becomes available, and then that norm by which to judge your results is out there to use.
Well, I think once there begin to be published results, and you get more than a couple, it'll begin to start to take some shape that you could make some comparisons against. The timing, we initiated the NORM-ROAST protocol definition and gathered the groups of manufacturers and experts back last summer in 21, and published the NORM-ROAST protocol in November of last year. And so it's the very early days right now of getting measurements. So I would expect over the coming months and perhaps even years that we'll begin to see a lot more results, and that'll allow for comparison of one to another.
Right. The more it catches on, the better the information, the more people contribute to it, right?
Absolutely.
That's great. So
Absolutely.
All you early adopters out there get a special part in building the foundation of something that could lead to a lot of energy savings and innovation in the industry. So that's pretty attractive. So obviously this has a lot of potential. Our conversations around how do we make things more efficient? How do we create more sustainability in the industry have to at some point turn into organized a process by which we can make these value claims, these judgments. And so this seems like something that's pretty promising. And in the meantime, while people are exploring that, we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to reduce our emissions and be responsible with the equipment that we currently have. And maybe it's a two-part question. How do we prepare ourselves for adopting this protocol or doing this protocol with our equipment? But also just generally, from your experience, what might be the best thing for us to look at in terms of optimizing our current equipment?
There, as I mentioned earlier, in Artisan, there is an energy calculator that can take information that is captured in the roast log and estimate the energy usage as well as the greenhouse gas emissions from any particular roast. Using a tool like that, a roaster or roast master can get a baseline on their own profiles, their own equipment, and their own process, and see where are they today, and from that baseline be able to evaluate changes, such as changing the warm-up process. We talked earlier about combining more roasts into any given roast session. Perhaps there are changes to the between batch protocol that can be made that will reduce the energy used and therefore the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions from any particular roast. And I think that's a way that a roast master today can get a handle on where do they stand and evaluate changes in their protocol and their procedure.
Just like we do with cupping, and we track along with the changes, and we can look back in our notes, be they notebooks or digital, and make correlative decisions around that. So this would be obviously something great to fold into your process, if it's not something you've already done. So that's great recommendation. And I think, again, this is showing a lot of promise. And if we want to learn more information about the NORM-ROAST protocol and all that it has to offer, where can we go to learn more?
Well, there's a website at norm-roast.org, and the NORM-ROAST protocol, as well as how it was defined, what motivated it, is available there on that website. There's also the article that I think prompted this discussion in Roast magazine in the current issue, March, April of 2022.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a couple of very useful references on the NORM-ROAST itself.
Well, it's great to talk to you, Dave. I appreciate you taking the time to talk about this and the work that you're doing to help make coffee roasting better for everyone and the planet. So I just really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, everyone. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. Ultimately, I feel like this is the kind of thing that we need to individually invest into in order to make it work, in order for this thing to gain steam. We're talking about, having more and more people apply this to their roasting equipment and provide that kind of demand for transparency and objective measures across manufacturers. And from the sound of it, it can really only serve to encourage the continued innovation in the direction of being responsible for the kind of energy consumption that comes along with coffee roasting. So I'm really thankful for people like Dave Baxter doing this work. And if you want to learn more about this protocol and how you can get involved, you can go to the website norm-roast.org, and you can find all you need to know right there. And of course, you should read the article that this conversation was springboarding from, called NORM-ROAST, in the latest issue of Roast Magazine, and you can do that over at roastmagazine.com. Huge thank you to Dave Baxter again for joining me, and thank you for joining me today. Have an amazing day, and as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.